Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues, on behalf of the Friends of André Chouraqui Association, I would like to begin by expressing our heartfelt thanks to the Open University of Israel for hosting this very meaningful, very impressive conference. Special thanks go to Professor Dennis Sharbet. Dennis, where are you? There? Yes. The chair of the Center for the Study of Relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and to the center's one and only coordinator, Miss Avital Erez. Avital, where are you? For their vision, leadership, and dedicated efforts in convening this important gathering, bringing together scholars, educators, and faith leaders from around the world to reflect on the lasting significance of the Nostra Aetate Declaration and the future of Jewish-Catholic relations. It is a great honor for me to stand here as we turn our attention to an important figure in this story, Dr. Nathan André Chouraqui. A man of words and action, of faith and diplomacy. A singular mission shaped Chouraqui's life: to bring people, faiths, and languages closer together. Born in Algeria to a family deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition, he became not only one of the Jewish people's and Israel's great scholarly and theological voices, but also a public servant and a statesman, whose vision of reconciliation extended across all of the Abrahamic religions. Among his many contributions, one stands out and especially timely in the context of our gathering today: his influential yet often quiet role in the process that led to the adoption of Nostra Aetate, the groundbreaking revolutionary declaration of the Second Vatican Council. As a vital interlocutor with the church leaders, Chouraqui helped shape the church's rethinking of its relationship with the Jewish people. Not as strangers, but as eternal sisters in faith and destiny. His legacy continues to inspire interfaith work, reminding us that words were chosen with great courage and great care. Words can open hearts and even rewrite history. The Nostra Aetate Declaration transformed the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people. And André Chouraqui was both a witness to that transformation and a quiet catalyst in its unfolding. Before I introduce to you our next speaker, who will bring us deeper into this story, I would like to take a moment to warmly acknowledge the presence of Madame Annette Chouraqui, André's beloved wife, and Mr. David Chouraqui, Michal Chouraqui, and Maya Chouraqui, the son, the daughter, and the granddaughter of André. Yes. Well deserved. We are truly honored by your presence, and we remember and celebrate the extraordinary legacy of your husband, father, and grandfather.
Thank you very much.
Of course. The Friends of André Chouraqui Association is deeply committed to carrying forward his extraordinary legacy, a legacy rooted in the conviction that interfaith dialogue is not a luxury, but a necessity for our shared future. In the spirit of Chouraqui, we strive to foster dialogue, understanding, and mutual respect among individuals and communities, particularly among the Abrahamic faiths. Recently, our association launched the Chouraqui program for religious tolerance and interfaith dialogue with the Open Universities Center for the Study of Relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, chaired by Professor Dennis Sherbit. Together, we aim to deepen academic research and promote meaningful encounters that bridge religious and cultural divides. As part of this joint effort, we are also developing an important new tool, the Chouraqui Tolerance Index. This index, hopefully, will help assess both the legal status and the lived reality of religious communities in Israel, offering a vital framework for evaluating religious freedom and interfaith coexistence in the Israeli society. And now, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Professor Mary Watson. Professor Mary Watson will speak on a front row seat for history, how André Chouraqui's pioneering life intersected with Nostra Aetate. Professor Watson is a distinguished theologian and biblical scholar. He studied at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome and earned his Ph.D. from Trinity College, Dublin. He currently serves as an adjunct professor of theology at Huron University College in Ontario and leads adult faith development in the Simcoe, Muskoka Catholic District School Board. Beyond your academic work, Professor Watson, you're deeply committed to the interfaith dialogue. For over 25 years, Professor Watson has worked closely with the Sisters of Notre-Dame de Sion, and he served as the Catholic representative on the Christian-Jewish Dialogue Committee of Toronto. His work combines intellectual depth and a profound commitment to the advancement of interreligious dialogue. Professor Watson, we are deeply, deeply grateful for your presence here today, and we know it took a lot of effort for you to arrive all the way from Toronto to Tel Aviv, and we are very appreciative of your willingness to share with us your reflection on André Chouraqui's legacy and the continuing relevance of Nostra Aetate in our time. Please join me warmly. Welcome, Professor Mary Watson. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. En commençant, j'aimerais d'abord exprimer ma gratitude aux organisateurs et aux organisatrices de cette conférence, et particulièrement aux membres de la famille Chouraqui qui sont présents cet après-midi. Ça me tient le cœur. Et en même temps, j'aimerais demander pardon aux francophones pour le fait que je parlerai cet après-midi en anglais. C'était une question de traduction et la complexité d'avoir des traducteurs d'anglais en français. Mais si vous désirez une traduction, j'en ferai après. In all of our lives, there are dates that are incredibly imprinted in our memory, that we can remember long after, we can remember where we were at the time, because that event was so significant, and sometimes it changed the path our life took. Thursday, September 30th, 1965, was one of those days in the life of André Chouraqui. As an Israeli politician who had experienced for years interfaith relations around the world, he was in the Vatican at St. Peter's Basilica for the last day of debate on the Second Vatican Council's highly controversial declaration, Nostra Aetate, on non-Christian religions, which had been under discussion for the better part of 4 years. In his first autobiography, L'amour fort comme la mort, Chouraqui recalls that Archbishop Pericle Felici, the Council's Secretary General, had invited him to witness the plenary session during which Nostra Aetate would be approved by the more than 2,000 bishops present for Vatican II. He recalled that that day began with an early morning mass honoring St. Jerome, the saint who of all the saints on the Catholic calendar, he said, certainly knew the most Hebrew. He noted the appropriateness of the document's final draft being circulated on Jerome's feast day, and he, who had met several previous popes on other occasions, remarked with amazement how in the course of that day I met more cardinals, archbishops, and bishops than all of my ancestors since the creation of the world. For most of us, being an eyewitness to that kind of history would have made enough of an impact on us to be remembered clearly years later. But unbeknownst to André Chouraqui, as the Vatican events were winding down, other events were just beginning to pick up speed. He arrived back at his hotel that evening to find a flurry of frantic messages from Teddy Kollek, his former colleague from the cabinet of David Ben-Gurion, asking if he would agree to serve as number 2 to Kollek on the municipal ballot for the election for Jerusalem's next mayor under the banner of the Rafi party. The nomination forms had to be submitted within the hour. Would André agree to join him? And so it was that the vote approving Nostra Aetate very unexpectedly provided the background for the beginning of André Chouraqui's 2 terms as deputy mayor of Jerusalem from 1965 to 1973, during both the 1967 and 1973 wars. He and Kollek would serve together at Jerusalem City Hall, with Chouraqui responsible for outreach to the city's religious and ethnic communities, including both Christians and Muslims. For all of those reasons, I am not surprised that September the 30th, 1965 remained forever a memorable date in André Chouraqui's life, a life that was filled with so many memorable and historic dates to which he was often an eyewitness and a protagonist. I think that wonderful coincidence, or perhaps providence, is worth recalling as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate this autumn and reflect together on the impact of those 6 decades. And although I am somewhat biased in this regard, I truly believe that it is only right that we should raise up the profile of André Chouraqui specifically as part of our celebrations, both here in Israel and around the world, because he was far more than just an eyewitness to the passage of Nostra Aetate and its approval. He had been one of those pioneers whose efforts had made the difference, had laid the groundwork for that declaration, and he would go on to be one of those who for decades would work tirelessly and very effectively to put its vision into practice locally, nationally, and globally. As I reflect as a Catholic theologian on Nostra Aetate's genesis and impact, André Chouraqui is one of the figures I believe best embodies what that document was attempting to do. Because of the era his life spanned from 1917 to 2007, André Chouraqui both helped to sow the seeds that would lead to Nostra Aetate and was one of its most ardent and articulate proponents for the 40 years after Vatican II. And because of his own remarkable life experiences, he could speak of the vital importance of Jewish-Christian dialogue and interfaith dialogue more generally, not merely theoretically, but with the authority of someone who has seen up close what the alternatives to dialogue look like, who has seen prejudice, discrimination, marginalization, violence, and war, and who can therefore speak authentically about dialogue not as a luxury, but as a necessity. In dozens of books, hundreds of lectures and meetings, André Chouraqui argued for the same vision that animated Nostra Aetate, and he helped to give it flesh. He was not Catholic, but Nostra Aetate was very much his document too. An important part of what enabled Chouraqui to be as effective as he was and to gain the receptive audience he found was the extremely fertile time in which he lived. He speaks in his autobiographies of growing up in colonial Algeria, in a world where Jews, Christians, and Muslims interacted on a daily basis in school, business, and social settings, and yet he recalled, instead of a respectful dialogue, there were bouts of religiously instigated violence, hostility, and discrimination that tended to keep people apart. As he wrote of his childhood, the Christian world around us seemed hostile. In their eyes, Jews were nothing more than God-killers, and Islam was a counterfeit religion born of the fevered mind of Muhammad. Such prejudices were openly taught. In Algeria, more than anywhere else, this was the brutal reality that condemned us all to live in our respective ghettos. We lived together in the same small town, and yet we knew almost nothing about each other. Nothing, that is, except for the contempt of which we were all the victims. The exterior world to us was a wound. My Jewish origin told me plainly in the brutally anti-Semitic atmosphere of colonial Algeria that I was from somewhere else. The hatred or the contempt of Christians, Muslims, and Jews kept us all separated from each other precisely because of what ought to have brought us most closely together, the religions born of the Bible, the Gospels and the Quran, which announced the same one God of unity and love. Chouraqui's childhood showed him some of the ugly ways that religion could be weaponized to keep people apart and to denigrate others, but it also gave him glimpses of the beauty and the richness of other faiths that made him curious and convinced him that there were other possible ways of interacting. He specifically mentions the kindergarten his parents sent him to, run by French Catholic nuns, but French nuns who were, he noted, scrupulous about respecting the religious identities of their young pupils. He says, Sister Ubaldine herself would never have thought of pushing Christianity on her Jewish pupils. When the young Christians were celebrating their rites or receiving their catechism classes, we were taken aside and guided in reflections about our own religious identity. Chouraqui admits very honestly that the laïcité, or state secularity, of the French Republican school system had largely led him to abandon the deeply Jewish world in which his family had raised him. He still went to synagogue for the high holy days, still fasted on Yom Kippur, avoided leavened foods during Pesach, but otherwise he had essentially given up on religion. As a university student in Paris, André's fairly carefree lifestyle as a student allowed him opportunities to travel across France, and he was particularly inspired and attracted by some of the French Gothic cathedrals, their architecture, and their art. But a second unforgettable date awaited him on February the 10th, 1937. André speaks of a mystical experience of spiritual illumination which convinced him once and for all that God was in fact real and that threw him back into a passionate study of the Bible and its commentaries. He said he felt seduced by this God of the Bible, and the religious questions that he had given up on years before now took on a new and central importance. He says, "My gloominess concerning religious matters was gone. All of this was made even more acute by what I was discovering in Europe: cathedrals, churches, religious music, Christian art, convents and monasteries, where so many outstanding men and women prayed day and night to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Elohim of my ancestors. I admired the cathedrals that served as landmarks along the roads, the sacred music and the liturgies. I loved the Gregorian chant whose origins stemmed from the temple in Jerusalem, like the chants of our Eastern synagogues. I came to know Christians who had nothing in common with the racists or with the medieval persecutors of my Jewish brothers and sisters in Europe. In some ways, it seemed that André's contact with Christians and Christianity were supporting this renewed religious identity that was growing within him once again. But those were also increasingly dark years, as the threat of Nazism began to increasingly become real. Grasping that he could be murdered simply for having been Jewish, André enrolled in the French Rabbinic Seminary and immersed himself in the study of Scripture, Talmud, Jewish thought, and liturgy. As he wrote, "If Hitler wanted to kill me for being Jewish, I wanted to be sure that I understood what being Jewish meant." Partway through his studies, the Nazi arrival in France shut down the seminary and scattered its students, some of whom continued their studies in a more clandestine way during their time in the wartime French underground, the Maquis. It was as part of the underground that the young Chouraqui came face to face with a figure who would go on to become one of the godfathers of modern Jewish-Christian relations, a man who has been evoked repeatedly this afternoon, the French Jewish historian Jules Isaac. After the capture and deportation of his family, Isaac had been sheltered in various safe houses where he was devoting his time to researching and writing a study of what he argued were historically incorrect Christian teachings about Jews and Judaism. Chouraqui had been asked to bring food and counterfeit identity papers to Isaac, whom he knew only as the author of his high school French history textbooks. The two quickly developed a friendship, which would last until Isaac's death in 1963. The book Isaac had been working on would eventually be published in 1948 as Jésus et Israël, and his research would provide an impetus for the establishment of the International Council of Christians and Jews and for its now famous inaugural conference in Salisbury, Switzerland. That research would also be a decisive factor in Pope John XXIII's decision to include a draft document on Judaism as part of his freshly announced council. In June 1960, as part of an audience with the Pope, Isaac had presented his research conclusions, asking the pontiff to take seriously his plea for a rethinking of Catholic teaching and praying about Jews, which the Pope received very sympathetically. Isaac's request, which aligned with other similar requests that were coming into the Vatican, would contribute the impetus for the document that 5 years later would be published as Nostra Aetate, and whose approval Isaac's protege André Chouraqui would witness. Isaac would not live to see that day, but Chouraqui realized that it marked the fruition of conversations he and Isaac had had in the waning months of the year of the war and in their post-war discussions. The Amitié Judéo-Chrétienne, or Jewish-Christian friendship associations that Isaac and Chouraqui helped to found in France 20 years earlier, presented a model that many Jewish-Christian dialogue groups would replicate and build on. So as we have seen, André Chouraqui had the privilege of being part of the intellectual circles that contributed to Vatican II, and he was actually present for the final vote on Nostra Aetate on the very day his career in Jerusalem municipal politics launched so unexpectedly. His growing up years in Algeria had sensitized him to both the positive and negative potential of religion and the need to break through the walls of inherited religious prejudice. And his years in Paris, before, during, and after the Second World War, had convinced him that only a radical reform of religious ideas and actions could ensure that the atrocities of the Shoah would never be repeated. It was work he would undertake vigorously, articulately, and unceasingly until his death in 2007, and for which his curriculum vitae had so eminently prepared him. Fortunately, he was living in a world where those ideas were slowly beginning to take hold, where his vision was shared by a growing number of Jews and Christians who believed that the time had come for a new and very different kind of relationship between those two ancient faiths, and of course Islam, but that is beyond the scope of my research. So how did André Chouraqui put flesh on the affirmations of Nostra Aetate, and especially its fourth paragraph on Christian-Jewish relations? With the benefit of hindsight, we can look back on that document and say that many of its lines are minimalistic and watered down, the result of compromise and politicking both within the council and from lobby groups outside. It is not a perfect document, and it is perhaps not even as good as some of the earlier drafts that were more daring. But of course, it was just the beginning, as several people have said today, and a hard-fought beginning. Those words needed to be tried out and implemented on local and national levels, and that is precisely what André Chouraqui set about doing in a wealth of different ways. One of the first ways he tried building those bridges of dialogue was in his new role as Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. He reached out to the city's religious minorities, offering the services of the municipality to meet their needs, and in 1967 he invited their leaders to Jerusalem City Hall for an initial meeting which was both unprecedented in Jerusalem and included a source of some comfort, discomfort, and a little bit of humor. It was the first time, he says, in Jerusalem's history that such a meeting had ever taken place. The ghettoization of the city had been almost complete. On the Christian side, there were communities from 11 different denominations who, for the most part, had no relations even with each other. The wall between Christians and Muslims had been closed off even more hermetically. We were meeting the leaders of those communities for the first time, but paradoxically, it was also the first time most of them had met each other under friendly circumstances. I particularly observed the effect on Mea Sharim's rabbis of this peaceful invitation to the city center involving many priests and nuns, imams, and qadis. Old Rabbi Purush was fascinated by the nuns whom he was seeing up close for the first time. Ah, he said, if only the daughters of Israel would dress as modestly as those sisters, with a flash of jealousy in his eyes. Throughout his career as a municipal politician, Chouraqui used his office and his fluency in Arabic, his mother tongue, to build relationships of trust, understanding, respect, and cooperation with both the Christian and Muslim leaders of the city. He wasn't just someone who was talking about dialogue, he was doing it. And doing it in a city where religion is always a powder keg ready to explode if it is mishandled. In ways that were sometimes small but always significant, he signaled to Israel's religious minorities that he saw them, respected them, and viewed them as important partners in building a city and a nation that saw religious pluralism not as a burden, but as a source of richness to be valued and fostered. But for those who knew him, none of that was a surprise. For 20 years, he had been actively engaged in doing that work, and for nearly 50 years since his childhood in Algeria, he had been keenly observing what did and did not make for positive interfaith relations. Over the course of the 40 years after Nostra Aetate, Chouraqui played a leading role in many of the organizations that attempted to capitalize on the momentum of that still infant interfaith movement. In the late 1950s, he was a founding member and president of the Israel Interfaith Association, and in 1967, he, along with the Jesuits Jean Danielou and Michel Riquet, Hamza Boubaker, the Imam of the Central Mosque in Paris, and the French writer Jean Nantais, co-founded the French Fraternité d'Abraham, Fraternity of Abraham. The initiatives brought together Jews, Christians, and Muslims at a time when the connectedness of those three monotheistic religions was not always taken for granted by everyone. But the Fraternité was the fruit of conversations that Chouraqui had been having with Danielou during the final sessions of Vatican II. As France and other countries stood on the cusp of the student riots of 1968, attacking institutions and denouncing traditional structures, the Fraternité offered a dramatically different vision of the role religion could play in society. And 50 years later, it is still active and still pursuing its original goals. It would also be in June of 1967 that the Israeli embassy in Rome opened an office for Vatican affairs, what Chouraqui referred to as an embryonic embassy, sowing the seeds of formal diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the State of Israel, which of course would only occur much later in December of 1993, more than a quarter century later, but again, after strenuous efforts on Chouraqui's part, both publicly and privately, to bring that about. Perhaps some of Chouraqui's most remarkable and lasting interfaith contributions have been through his prolific writings, many of which address topics of interreligious dialogue, either directly or indirectly. Among his dozens of publications are book-length letters to his Christian and Muslim friends, studies of Moses, Jesus, and St. Paul, a play about the trial of Jesus, and discussions of the importance of Jerusalem for the followers of all three of the Abrahamic faiths. Over the decades, many of those books have been translated into other languages, which means that his reach has expanded considerably. But one of Chouraqui's arguably greatest contributions to post-Nostra Aetate interreligious conversation is undoubtedly his work in translating and commenting on the holy books of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His Bible Chouraqui, first published in the mid-1970s and still in print today, included his startlingly fresh translation of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. It was part of a larger project that he completed in 1990 with his translation of the Quran. That massive undertaking not only made him almost certainly the only individual in history to have single-handedly translated all of the Abrahamic scriptures himself, but it meant that he had a unique vantage point with which to throw a light on common terms and shared themes. Having grappled himself with all of those texts, he was uniquely qualified to show the degree of theological overlap among them, which he attempted to underscore through intentional consistency in his choice of vocabulary. Today, the Jewishness of Jesus is taken for granted by most biblical scholars. It is the starting point for exploring the humanity of the one Christians consider the Messiah and Son of God. But it also provides an entry point for Jewish scholars to comment on Jesus and his teachings. But in the early 1970s, Chouraqui's decision as an Israeli Jewish intellectual also to translate the Christian scriptures scandalized some of his co-religionists and raised more than a few eyebrows. But Chouraqui wanted Christians to realize that the one they worshipped as Savior had been a son of this land, had been a child of the Galilee, who prayed Jewish prayers, who spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. And he wanted his fellow Jews to acknowledge the same things, to realize that the Gospels could provide a fruitful and meaningful meeting point for Jews and Christians. By choosing Hebrew proper names and terminology that would be familiar to Jewish readers, he wanted to make the same point that Nostra Aetate made in paragraph 4. The Church also keeps constantly before its eyes the words of the Apostle Paul concerning those of his own race. And to them belong the adoption as children, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and of their race, according to the flesh, is Christ, Son of the Virgin Mary. It also recalls that the apostles were born out of the Jewish people, as were many of Jesus' first disciples. Or as Chouraqui would say in 1995, it is in this spirit that I have retranslated the texts of the Hebrew Bible to restore their Semitic flavor for those in the West, and in the same way the texts of the New Testament to reinsert them into their proper historical context and Semitic underpinnings. For the West must find its way back to the East, and Japheth must once again dwell under the tents of Shem. Chouraqui is one of the only Bible translators who intentionally embraced the improvement of interreligious dialogue as a primary criterion for his translation. While his translations can sometimes make for challenging reading, they express the vision that animated his whole adult life, and they remain as a powerful creative testimony to his conviction that sacred scriptures have the potential to be bridges of greater understanding rather than walls that keep their adherents apart. In a 1985 lecture at the French Church of Saint Louis in Rome, he recalled by name many of those whose pioneering work alongside his had made Nostra Aetate possible, and he highlighted French figures including Jules Isaac, Edmond Flegge, and Cardinal Jules Saliège. He spoke glowingly of the 2 decades of reconciliation that he had already seen between Jews and Christians, and then he added, and might I say, my recent translation of the Hebrew Bible and the New Covenant is grounded in the spirit of that reconciliation. He spoke of the relationship that had been established between Jerusalem and Rome, and he said, it is in keeping with the path opened by those people that I stand here before you today. Time does not allow me to enumerate all of the many contributions Chouraqui made to interfaith dialogue during his long and fruitful life. His published autobiographies detail them thoroughly and with his own commentary. To those who have not yet had the opportunity to explore them, and to those of you who read French, I strongly encourage you to delve into L'amour fort comme la mort, Mon testament le feu de l'alliance, and Ce que je crois, which is in English translation titled A Man in Three Worlds. Because as remarkable as André Chouraqui's contributions in interreligious dialogue are, they are only one piece of a very rich and multifaceted life, which also includes the domains of politics, law, literature, translation, drama, and history. I cannot imagine a figure who is more worthy of inclusion in a conference like this one than André Chouraqui is. His life intersected in a very literal way with Nostra Aetate. He was an eyewitness to its final approval in Rome after its long, winding, and uncertain path to promulgation. But he was also among those who had already been laying the foundation long before Vatican II, in the 2 decades that he worked with Jules Isaac and was mentored by him. Jules Isaac, whose plaintive cry for a Christian rethinking of Judaism was such an important catalyst in convincing John the 23rd of the necessity of such a document. Already in 1945, Chouraqui had written these words to Isaac: "Is not what unites us to Christians more important than what separates us from them? And has not the time arrived for a Judeo-Christian rapprochement, for a reunion in this time when we have in common millions of martyrs? Jesus in Israel seemed to me infinitely closer than Jews, and most Christians too, believe." That was 1945. In a very real way, Chouraqui was an early co-conspirator with Isaac in that mission. He extended and built upon his teacher's work after Isaac's death in 1963, and he continued to push those theses forward, expanding and enriching them with his own reflections and insights until André's own death in 2007. It is not surprising at all that Jerusalem recognized him 4 years ago by dedicating Kikar Nathan André Chouraqui Square. As part of its dedication ceremony, the Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Denis Segui, spoke these words to the attendees: "It can be said that Dr. Chouraqui is one of the greatest spiritual minds of the Jewish people and of the State of Israel in the 20th century. His name and actions have not sufficiently penetrated Israeli cultural circles. The inauguration of this square is an important step in introducing his vision and mission to the public of Israel." Those are sentiments I would endorse 150%. And for that reason, I am so pleased that his name and his work and his legacy are being celebrated as part of this celebration of Nostra Aetate's 60th anniversary. Because André Chouraqui was there at the moment of Nostra Aetate, but he was there long before it, tilling the soil that helped to make it possible. And even though he was Jewish and not Catholic, he embodied Nostra Aetate's vision and helped for decades to advance it all over the world. He was committed to those beautiful Latin words, but he also ensured that they did not merely stay on the page. He labored to put them into practice in ways that continue to influence and inspire us even now, 18 years after he left us. But I ask, in the powerful, inspiring legacy he entrusted to us, has he really left us? When André died in 2007, the French journalist Henri Tank wrote a beautiful appreciation of him for Le Monde. In it, Tank said, "His translation only makes full sense within the framework of the brotherhood of the people of the book to which he always aspired, first in Paris and later on in Jerusalem. Unquestioned specialists in the Quran congratulated him, but the fundamentalists were scandalized. Christian fundamentalists reacted the same way when this Jew embarked on translating the gospel of Christ. This was the first time that one man had translated all 3 of those holy books. Each word of them was chosen, was chiseled out, according to a daunting type of intellectual gymnastics. It was a work that was, at the same time, an act of faith in understanding among those 3 religions." In a message of condolence to Madame Chouraqui and their family, the French President Nicolas Sarkozy wrote, "The work that your husband has left to posterity is of major importance. He played a major role in the rapprochement of the 3 monotheistic religions, inspired by his passion for brotherhood. His translations of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are the legacy of a humanistic intellectual to whom people searching for spirituality will continue to refer." Almost 18 years later, the fact that I am here in Tel Aviv speaking about André Chouraqui to such an interested audience of friends and scholars confirms for me that his interreligious legacy is not an archaeological one confined to the past, but one of tremendous relevance to the present and the future. As I reflect on the situation you are living here in this land, as I reflect on the situation throughout the Middle East, I cannot help wondering how his insights and example might speak to us in thinking about these painful realities and shed light upon a path forward which right now is difficult to imagine, but also necessary. Nostra Aetate was a Catholic document. As a Jewish man, it did not directly concern André Chouraqui. He was not bound by it in any religious or moral sense, and yet I believe he was one of the most radiant examples I can point to of someone who realized its potential, embraced it wholeheartedly, and brought its message into everything that he said and did, implicitly and explicitly. He was one of those who planted seeds which flowered in Nostra Aetate, and as he wrote in a book about diplomatic relations between Israel and the Holy See, this four-page conciliar text, despite its brevity and its successive reworkings, marked a revolutionary starting point in the Church's relations with other religions. Jacques Vidal said that the Church now addresses universal religious questions by beginning with the questions that Judaism and Jews raise for the Church. And André pushed us as Catholics and Christians not to stop there, but to engage in dialogues that produced many other subsequent documents and accomplishments which went further and dared more, including the establishment of diplomatic relations between this country and the Holy See more than 30 years ago. As we celebrate Nostra Aetate's 60th anniversary this year, I am so grateful to André Chouraqui for the courage he showed and the risks he took, for being such a visionary partner with the Catholic Church in that work, and for showing us that dialogue is both possible and necessary. May his example continue to inspire and guide us as Jews and Christians and Muslims too, in the hard, demanding work of building a world of which he would be proud, a world which I am naive enough to believe is still possible for all of us. Merci, toda rabba.
Incredible, insightful presentation. Thank you so much. I think that we need these words. We need the spirit of Chouraqui, especially at this time, and you brought it back, and you gave us more hope, and it is so important for us. Thank you so much, Denise. Professor Charbet allowed us a little bit more time for Q&A, if you have. So if there's any questions or any comments, yes, Enrico Molinero came all the way from Jerusalem.
Which today seems to be farther than Canada, because it was 2 hours of incredible traffic. But it's not really a question, it's a joke. It's a joke that I got from the chief legal advisor of the Israeli negotiators with the Holy See, Tzvi Terlo. Some of you might not remember the name. There is a lot of things about providence today, because by chance, when I was a doctoral student on the Holy Place of Jerusalem, Monsignor Fumagalli, the academic director of the Monastery of Ratisbon, which was devoted to Jewish studies for Christians, saw that I didn't have any money, I was just a student, and in Italy they pay you if you do the PhD. Here you have to pay. So he hosts me in the monastery, giving me a job as the librarian. So I saw these strange people coming in and out, and these were, the Holy See delegation and the Israeli delegation. I didn't realize how much important was this momentum. Then, Paroline used to ask me, when he was under Secretary of State, some questions about not only the bilateral agreements with Israel, but also the Ottoman Empire customs, about the fiscal rights, it's a mess. I just spoke with the former legal advisor of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, Ehud Keinan, about this. He's an expert. So the joke is the following. I think it's true because he was very convinced when he told me. Tzvi, he told me that, and this could be relevant today, what was the relationship between Israel and the Jewish people? The Vatican delegation, especially someone who was from an Orthodox Jewish Israeli family in Tel Aviv, Father David Yeager, he said absolutely no relation. State of Israel is something, and Jewish people is something else. So Tzvi Terlo said, okay, wait for me. He quoted all the speech of the popes mentioning this relation. And he put it in the preamble of the fundamental agreement. You know, the text is there. And he said, so are you against your pope? So they were obliged to keep something that is very relevant today, I think. It's about zeut, you know, identity. So there is another joke, but this is more a legend. I don't think it's true. Because apparently the Israelis were talking Hebrew with each other, sure that the Vatican delegation would never understand, you know. Who knows Hebrew? And so apparently, this is a legend, I don't know if it's true, David Yeager did not say that he was Israeli, of course, Hebrew speaking. And at a certain moment, again, it's a legend, they started to make jokes in Hebrew, and he started to laugh. He said, how come you laugh? So, you know Hebrew? Okay, this was a joke. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can tell you, Nico, that I was part of the later negotiations, and on one hand, we appreciated so much the level of knowledge and depth of Yeager, Professor Yeager, but on the other hand, we were all scared of him so much. So, absolutely.